Good afternoon and welcome to Te Wharewanapa Ōrākei Lincoln University. My name's Grant Edwards and I'm the Vice Chancellor here at Lincoln University. It is my absolute pleasure this evening to introduce this year's recipient of the Lincoln University's most prestigious alumni honour, the Bledisloe Medal. This award recognises excellence and leadership in New Zealand's land-based sectors, and this year we honour a truly outstanding contributor to agricultural science and innovation, Dr. Robyn Dynes. We welcome Robyn here today with her friends and family and many of her colleagues from across the sectors. Robyn completed a Bachelor of Agricultural Science at Lincoln College in 1986, and then completed a PhD in Animal Science at Lincoln University, finishing in 1994. Robyn has built a career defined by relevance, connection, and impact. With more than 2 decades at Ag Research, she has led significant work in flock efficiency, pasture quality, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change adaptation. Always with a practical eye of how science can improve farm systems and outcomes for the people at their heart. She is a rare and influential voice working across all 3 major agricultural sectors: arable, dairy, sheep and beef. And she plays an active leadership role with organisations such as the Foundation for Arable Research, Beef and Lamb New Zealand, the Southern Dairy Hub, and right here at Lincoln University. Robyn's strategic focus has always been in science and how it can be applied. Science that makes a difference on the ground. Her leadership of the Whiti Whiti Ora program, part of the National Science Challenge, Our Land and Water, exemplifies bringing together researchers, industry and universities to explore land use opportunities that go beyond profit. She describes herself as someone who sits at the table with farmers, and is this embedded, grounded perspective that makes her science not only rigorous, but trusted, respected, and adopted. In all this, I think Robyn puts agriculture at the central part of what she does, and central to New Zealand's well-being. And if we are to flourish, our food and fibre industries must be forward-thinking, responsible, and respected. Her challenge to all of us, I think, is: are we doing enough to earn our social licence to demonstrate progress and to remain a world-leading producer of safe, sustainable food? It is only fitting that Robyn receives the Bledisloe Medal, which she will receive at a graduation event shortly, from the university that shaped her own path and to which she remains deeply connected. A proud Lincoln alumna, Dr. Dynes continues to champion the role of science, innovation and education in shaping a stronger future for New Zealand. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robyn Dynes for the 2024 Bledisloe Medal Address.
Vice Chancellor Grant, thank you for your words. It's an honour to be awarded the 2025 Bledisloe Medal and a privilege to be here today. I believe I may be the first medalist who's been required to deliver an oration, so I get you for the next half an hour, guys. Thank you for those words, and I'd like to start by acknowledging my colleagues, Jenna Heller, Dr. Sue Zeidenbos and Tony Connor, because they were the people that spun the story. I'd also like today to recognise my colleagues from the Endophyte research team, who were last night awarded the Prime Minister's Prize. And also acknowledge that we lost a true legend last week with the loss of Trish Fraser from Plant and Food. She was a soil scientist, a fabulous friend, and just a legend. Grant did miss my first qualification. As a 16-year-old, I completed an equine artificial insemination course under the tutelage of Professor Cliff Irvine, ably assisted by Julie Turner. I went on, and it was a great experience. So enough said on that. At the time, Lincoln was, for many years, a global leader in its equine research under Cliff Irvine. If I came back from my agricultural science degree in the 80s and back for my PhD. And since coming back to ag research in 2004, I've rebuilt my links with Lincoln through co-supervising PhD students, undertaking collaborative research. So I'm very honoured to get the medal. Lincoln University has shaped my life and my career. Lincoln is gold in the fabric of New Zealand's agriculture and must be courageous to thrive into the future. Courage, of course, is making me the 4th female to receive this award. So recently, I, with some in the room, was at the Anzac Day Dawn Parade in Cathedral Square. And as the sun rose over the square, it reminded me that tomorrow is 80 years since VE Day. And we must learn from the past. The price our families, our communities, and our nation paid through that period of war, we must remember. In my context, despite the challenges, I know has been in what's known as the peace dividend. That is the economic boost that comes after periods of war. And it's been a time when our world trade has flourished. And I think if we look back from where we're standing today, we know that our golden era of trade is probably now behind us. Today I want to explore what I've taken from those lessons of the last 80 years. The complexity of the future as I see it. And I want to show you some of the impacts from the science that I've been involved in. And finally, you'll get a bit of my story. Some of you know I delivered the levy oration at the Grasslands Conference late last year. As you should do when you get the levy oration, you first go to understand the story of Sir Bruce Levy. He knew how to wear a fine suit. That a few more of you blokes would wear a few more suits, it would be good for the woolens. Think I joke, I don't. Sir Bruce was an agricultural science pioneer. He championed the grasslands revolution. I was struck not only by the excellence of his science, but his deep understanding of the context within the farm gate and beyond the farm gate and internationally. And I would challenge you all to go back and read his 1950 paper that he delivered to Grasslands Conference in Invercargill. It's a masterpiece in how farmers should be growing and utilising pasture, feeding their ewes properly. He talked about the social science. He talked about what farmers were thinking and talking about and what he believed they should actually talk about. And I think he was hinting of where we find ourselves today with our challenge of groupthink and the echo chambers that it's so easy to fall into. Levy focused first on lifting pastoral production, in turn building the foundations for the future of the pastoral systems that we've all benefited from. And at that point, we were the UK's far-flung livestock farm, and we really were at the forefront. My grandfathers were farmers in this day. I'd like to proudly say that that's the directors of the Wyndham Dairy Factory. It's actually not. It's the Wyndham Racing Club Committee. You may laugh, but racing is very important to the rural fabric. And I was bred into a racing family, well and truly. So despite how productive we were through that time, the international context changed. The USA imposed tariffs. And that lift in productivity that we'd experienced wasn't enough. The slump in demand through the Depression was a tough time for farming. And it was one where our paternal grandparents actually walked off their sheep and beef farm. Now, if we jump back to post-World War II and looking at the 80 years since, just immediately after the war, the New Zealand government was preoccupied with growing the value of exports from our agriculture. And agriculture had already shown its potential. This is for Mike Manning, spoon. The return of those Royal Air Force pilots back to New Zealand gave us a skill that we hadn't had previously. And the first aerial top dressing experiments were at Ohakea in 1948. The results were so promising that it immediately kicked off a new industry with a step change in the productivity of our hill country sector. Back then, of course, the UK was our dominant market. And the rules that we put in place after those wars to enable global trade enabled us to grow and flourish. We were protected by GATT and the World Trade Organization. And finally, we had both the productivity and the markets that wanted our product. I want to tease a little bit because I keep talking about context. There's quite a few of us in this room, because why context is important, it's the backdrop. It shapes meaning, it shapes interpretation, and it shapes how relevant we see information. We all know things have a different meaning with context. And for those of us in the room who had bought a house or owned a farm in the 1980s, we know what interest rates above 20% felt like. And we do wonder why those young things are complaining so much when it got to 8%, right? It's all about context. Their context is different to what ours was back then. So my life and my working career have just traversed distinctly different phases. And yet, we keep being surprised by the consequences of what we do. Do we forget what happened before? Or were we not listening and observing? Because already I've talked about things that have happened before and seem to be happening again right now. So that first phase, Richard Laheron, who's now at the University of Auckland, from 1960 to 1984, he described as the state-led expansion. During this time, my parents, Cliff and Alvina, were on a pathway to owning their first farm. Over 10 years, they started with a small dairy herd, and in pretty short order, they owned 200 hectares of rolling sheep and beef country just north of Gore. Now, Pukerell was a farming community of ambitious young farmers. Cliff was the Secretary of Federated Farmers, and at the time, 1970, they were wrestling with the meat and wool boards and questioning whether they were getting enough return for their product. And ironically, whether the vets were making too much money in the drench sales. How much has changed? And it was a time when agriculture was nurtured by the government. From farm advice and who as kids went to the dog dosing strip, not sure that'd be allowed today, and the rabbit board. Gosh, I remember the rabbit board guys turning up on the farm. It was a great time for farming. This was an extraordinary time in the 1960s for scientific discovery. Blackster and Clapperton, they rewrote in the 1960s our understanding of methane emissions. This graph shows you the number of other papers that have cited their work in a given year. Not surprisingly, the last 15 years there's been more citations of their papers than there was in the first 40. Why? Because methane has literally become a hot topic. All built on the foundation at that time. Our life and farming journey was abruptly changed in 1970 with the sudden death of our mother. This left Cliff raising 3 small children alone, whilst funding a mortgage, farming, and putting up with us. So our formative years were raised by a man, one who always had 2 pockets of binder twine, plus a belt made of binder twine, plenty of number 8 wire on hand, a can-do attitude, and I think you would say few boundaries. He encouraged us to try anything and do anything. It was a time of perhaps best described as experiential learning, and there were valuable lessons in life and little health and safety requirements. And as the 70s wore on, the state-led expansion of agriculture was demanding more and more financial support. And at the same time, the reliance on the single market was starting to be shaky. Quite pleased that my husband's second cousin, John Chetman, is not here, because I think my statement might have sent John off to say I was wrong, but he's not, so I can say it. And for us, the late 70s was a new beginnings. We were a newly blended family, and we moved to mid-Canterbury to a small mixed cropping farm on Thompson's Track. The key selling point from Cliff was there's no mud in Canterbury. Our farm was every girl's ideal. We always had ponies. We had gallopers in Southland and standard breds in Canterbury. Doesn't this graph say? Look from the pioneering days from our natural unimproved fertility. Rog, look what science did for farming. Look at that expansion of the number of sheep that we had. Thanks to our fertiliser companies, we saw those responses. And then what subsidies could do. But as the time of the Muldoon era came to a close and supplementary minimum prices were embedded, it was masking the world reality that they didn't really want our product like they had. Our focus on exporting turned largely and maybe uncritically to the growth in the physical volume that we were producing, rather than the underlying economic value, in a time before we thought about the environmental cost. This volume focus ignored optimising our systems, and yet that's what Levy, through the 1930s and 40s, kept reminding us to do. This was the era of the small ewe, the 100% lambing and a 12-kilo carcass. And that infamous snap election in 1984, which of course Robert Jones had a big hand in, Bob Jones, with the outcome that precipitated change to the agricultural landscape at a rate which we hadn't seen previously. This change brought heartache, and I guarantee most in the room can point to members of their family that have been affected through a lifetime. But we did what we do best in New Zealand. The economic transformation happened. The productivity phase emerged. Farmers had to produce what the market valued. Ewe numbers fell. We went in a remarkably short period of time to 125% lambing, 17-kilo carcass. You give our farmers the right signals, then they will respond. And that was built on strong science foundations and the management and adaptability of our people. And of course, we saw the survival and then the thriving of our sectors. And I think if we look back on this time, the New Zealand science system was a powerhouse. It was strong both at the discipline level and right through to the farm systems. And if we look at the length of the country, from woodlands to Tara Hills to Winchmore, and those things in the north, science had the back of its farmers and was in a leading role. Of course, while this was unfolding, some of us were students at Lincoln College. These were great years. Agricultural science degree was exceptional training. It was built on the foundations of plants, animals, soils, and management. Agricultural engineering was a blast. Duckworth and Dynes, because you always worked in groups by your surname, tuning at diesel fuel injectors was memorable for probably all the wrong reasons. It's all right, my brother's a mechanic. The field trips were cross-disciplinary, exploring systems, understanding farmer decision-making. Prompt White always had a spade. The North Island field trips were an experience in many dimensions. Those that have been on them are the ones that are laughing. We learned a lot, of course. With apologies to Professor Mooch, we've determined that he was on an international exchange when this photo was taken. This was a pretty difficult time for the New Zealand economy. Unemployment, interest rates and inflation were high. We females were in the minority. It was 20% in our class, but I suspect we were a lot of females relative to the rest of the university. Finding jobs as female and finding jobs on farms to complete our prep was hard, but even harder for the females. Of course, I was a well-connected farming girl, so My Southland first job was someone my father had worked for 40 years before. The second one was the amazing Graham Robertson, arable farmer from mid-Canterbury. Still rates as one of the best bosses I've ever had. My connections and my farm experience made a difference. The female classmates in my class, they had a crap time getting a job, and the worst of experiences. It's true that our context and time were different, and I'm so very pleased the young women of today don't have to put up with what we did. And in the style of the young and youth, it was only much later I fully understood the unique value that Lincoln College, as it was then, gave me and my colleagues as we embarked on the world. Post-graduation, remember, times were tough. I found myself as a nutritionist for the Poultry Women's Cooperative. These were both broiler farmers and egg producers. Truthfully, I hated chickens. That's all right. I infamously killed rather many of Sir Roger Douglas's pigs. I don't feed Sunday bread to Roger Douglas's pigs. The outcome's not pretty. But that was a crash course in where science meets commercial reality. And as the newbie, I had to man the phones. Did we really put antibiotics in our chicken? No, we didn't. But quite quickly, the lure of pastoral farming, or maybe it was a scholarship offered, drew me back to Lincoln, where I undertook a PhD on the impact of gastrointestinal parasites on feed intake in lambs. My arrival coincided with the share market crash of 1987, which was more economic instability for New Zealand. Graham Burrell assured us that our timing was perfect, and by the time we finished our PhD, things would be looking up. Graham wasn't actually right on that. But however, economics must, so I married John. We met during our egg side breed, but he'd wisely taken a job with IBM. IBM was growing at plus 30% in those days, and it paid bonuses. But to keep him grounded, he used to shovel sheep manure every weekend. He said that was to help me out, but really it's because he hated gardening. My studies include models of feed intake in ruminants. And I look back on this as a major learning phase, far beyond what I chose to study. I had dynamic supervisors, a department that was big and engaged in educating us postgraduates. There were practical, philosophical, and life lessons in that one. From Dennis Poppy, Andrew Sykes, Alistair Nichol, Phil Beatson, Graham Burrell, and Rob McFarlane, to name a few. They demanded that we defend our science. We learned debating research meant comments and criticism, and you all knew Andrew Sykes, were of the science and not of the person. And if you mounted robust arguments, all was good. From Dennis Poppy, one valuable lesson: networks and network globally. He encouraged the females in the room to take Professor Maggie Gill to Strawberry Fair for breakfast, which we did. Now, Maggie was a scientist at the time who went on to be the head of the Macaulay Institute, the chief scientist for Scotland, and a range of other roles. She's also been on international science advisory groups. And every decade since then, my path has crossed with Maggie's. That payback from that breakfast has been enormous. As I closed out my PhD in 1991, the context in New Zealand was shifting rapidly. The productivity phase for agriculture was underway. Dawn Daly got a job in dairying, but the economic realities for the rest of us were tough. Unemployment was 11%, so John and I did what you do best, packed up and headed overseas. I was fortunate to be offered a permanent position with CSIRO animal production in Western Australia. So to Perth we went. At the time, CSIRO was realigning where its staff were with where its agricultural production came from, which meant the Sydney siders had to shift to Perth, which they didn't want to do. And that was my opportunity. Perth was the home of black swans, the West Coast Eagles, the Perth Breakers, and where rugby was actually well down the list. That was the first of many restructures that I have walked through, experienced and navigated as a career scientist. CSIRO is a great establishment and my connections to it are diverse. We lost 100 staff over the plastic banknote court case because it self-insures. So if you're a scientist, keep good records and don't try and sell the technology twice because you might get caught out. My start date, back to the economics. I started in 1991. Most of the group's income came from wool. The floor price for wool was removed and our income from the AWI dropped with it through the floor. Australia is vast and scale took on a whole new meaning. To find research sites, we once drove 1,500 kilometres in our Holden ute. And we thought nothing of driving 3.5 hours to weigh a mob of sheep. So when I came back here, Tom Fraser was my team leader. I drove to Blenheim for a meeting and back again in the same day. And Tom was very cross at me. I didn't realise that was a long drive. We welcomed 3 kids when we were in Perth. It's a land of endless beaches and summers. There's no puddles, but plenty of sand. As my career responsibilities grew, I balanced parenthood with the demands of travel because everything there is at least 3.5 hours away. It was particularly tough as a working parent in such a vast landscape, but where else but CSIRO would your colleague, when hearing of your challenges, build you a double breast pump just to help you out? You can appreciate it when I say context is everything. The agricultural landscape, yes, is very different, but so is government. You have a state government and a federal government, and they impact on science priorities and focus. It's highly urbanised. Mineral wealth underpins everything. Agriculture, whilst important, is a lesser player in the economy. And it was very hard in WA to understand how important the Murray-Darling Basin is to everything. Add to this a mixture of Mediterranean climate, extensive farms. When you ask someone how big their farm is and they say 12,000 hectares, and I had to ask how many families does that support to have any understanding. This was a massive learning curve, and it's one I would challenge every Kiwi to do. Our work was on the plant-animal interface in the Mediterranean. If we could find a plant that in autumn had 50% digestibility, we were made. Because most plants are not there in autumn. Now I want to talk about the impact from science. This is one that I'm particularly proud of. So we took our fundamental research on nutritive and feeding value. We partnered with Gilmac, who are the biggest export oaten hay producer in Australia. They export the oaten hay to dairy cows in Japan. Of course, my boss went to school with Peter Mackey, so that's how we started the work. We built algorithms for nutritive value. This enabled Gilmac to set a new standard in quality, and they aggressively pursued that. They offered a money-back guarantee that the cows would always eat their oaten hay. It shifted the trade from subjective to objective overnight. And look at the size of premium they got. Now, they were only exporting 500,000 tonnes back then. We had to then quickly backfill with a lot of science to fill the specifications. Today, they're exporting more than 1 million tonnes. And when you drive a lot in WA to get from trial site to trial site, you run out of politics and religion to talk about. So we used to talk about what we would do if we lost our jobs. I was going to drive one of those rigs. One of those came to deliver hay to me in the city, and I was counting the number of gears he changed down. And when he got to 26, I was quite impressed. And then I had to climb into the cab. Have you ever done that? I would. So late 1990s, secondary salinity was becoming an issue in WA. In fact, it was the political hot potato. It impacts agriculture, infrastructure, biodiversity, water resources. It's a wicked problem where environment meets economics, where the pubs in small towns were crumbling. So it's got a social and a cultural bottom line. Sustainable grazing of sabine land was my first genuinely transdisciplinary research program. The Cooperative Research Centre for Dryland Salinity was the platform. This work was in the early 2000s, and at the time, I was leading 2 separate projects, each around $1.5 million. We were funding a full pipeline of research from PhD students to farmers running split paddock comparisons. An output of that, some 15 years after I left, was Anemika. That's a saltbush which is preferred by animals, and you get about the best performance you can get out of saltbush. Bearing in mind, an animal has to eat one entire saltbush to maintain its live weight. Anemika was one of those 2 farms we visited on our first 1,500-kilometre round trip. So come 2004, John pulled up anchors and determined we thought we should leave Perth. And WA was hard to leave. I built networks and expanded and reset my thinking on farm systems. I'd experienced that very different context where politics and urban pressures were both constraint and opportunity, where the power brokers were distant, the farmers different and yet the same. The Australian CRC model, where it works, is outstanding. It's been a game changer for research in Australia and continues to be so. So I came back to New Zealand, one of those annoying returnees, with all of this learning on board, with a clear understanding that urban dwellers, environmental drivers, local and global politics were changing farming context. I came back at the time of dairy expansion and the growing importance of China to our market, and saw firsthand how dairy expansion gave us a soft landing in the GFC. And it was almost the silent arrival of this new phase, which Hamish Gale likes to refer to as the constrained optimised system. It's the one where we have to find a balance between environment and productivity. And what I saw coming back was how my colleagues were leaning into the emerging domestic freshwater challenges and the international drivers around climate change. What I didn't see was a significant awareness amongst our farming community of the rate this change was happening, rather that productivity drive. Now, back in the 1980s, while at Lincoln College, my mate Paula and I, unthinkingly, first day, second semester, stepped like this into the bottom of one of the big Hildendorf lecture theatres. Wasn't our class, it was DePag. Anyone's ever done that? They were quite noisy. We exited very quickly. I got that same noisy reception in 2004 in the Stewart Lecture Theatre. When taking the learnings from Australia, I posed a question to the then chair of Central Plains Water on the share of benefits New Zealand, pointed out that I might like to quite see the water left in the river because I might want to go fishing. Well, the room erupted, attacking me. My point was, if we're to flourish as agriculture, we have to take the whole country on the journey. And that was a demonstration to me of what I learned in Australia. When the urban dweller holds a vote, make sure they're in the back seat. My role in AgriCert from day one was very different to Australia. I worked with farmers on farm and in tech transfer. The rich diversity of networks across New Zealand has grounded my views since then. And I'm grateful for many of the farmers who continue to give me their time. And this is my time to shout out to my brother-in-law, Roger. He's one of my Fona farmers. And one early discussion that sparked up was when I suggested border type irrigation could and would not last. He was quite abusive when he rang up to tell me that he'd signed up to pay a lot of money for spray irrigation. I think he got the most mileage though at the pub after him and I went and bought rams together. He never did invite me back to go red buying. So our future for the science system in agriculture, I contend we were front and centre through phase 1 and 2. That's the royal we, because some of us were not quite there yet. That phase had long-term funding and systems trials and real leadership, where 650 farmers turned up to the Ruapura Farmers Conference. But were we leading in enough leadership around the unintended consequences of what we were doing? But I think that requires a beer for that conversation. For much of the time I've been back in New Zealand, we've been on shorter term funding. We've been on the hamster wheel of continually seeking the next set of funding. But I think there are some things that Lincoln University can be very proud of. Castle 21, which was the government industry partnership, focused on systems level solutions for profitability, profitably increasing production while reducing environmental footprint. And where I think its merit was, we started in the workshops around what the modelling should look like. It transitioned to research farmlets, including here at Lincoln University. And it was a paradigm shift at the time for industry accessible, adoptable systems, demonstrating collaboration, transdisciplinary research, both growing knowledge and the capability in all of the students that were involved. And then to the commercial scale at LUDF, with a chance to understand the intended and unintended consequences of change through the seasons and years. It's a slightly younger Ron Pello in this picture. It's from 10 years ago, Ron. But I think we have to give real credit to Ron and Peter and the team at Lincoln University Dairy Farm that took that science and put it into practice and walked us through what was required to achieve that. So 10 years on, are we on the edge of the fourth phase in my time, or is it a tweak to the third? So in February, Fonterra announced the opportunity for its farmers to be eligible for a customer incentive payment. Now this focuses on the intensity of emissions to air. That's where the focus is. What do we as science need to think about? We have further disruption to globalisation going right now. An exporting future is currently in the hands of FTAs and customer-driven incentives. So we as a science community have to challenge ourselves here. And what have we missed? Dave Chapman's Ray Brougham address was a sobering analysis. He and his colleagues have now published this. And this shows the pasture productivity between 1990 and 2020 in terms of pasture eaten per hectare. And what we can see in that decade from 1990, the real gains. This is what New Zealand does well. It consumes a lot of pasture and it turns it into a high value product. But look at the last 20 years. That sharp decline in the slope means not much is happening here. Despite the fact that we've got more nitrogen use, higher stocking rates and more irrigation, more genetics than ever before. So how resilient is our national pasture resource? The authors found that we don't have enough data. And we only know some of the potential causes for this. And we know even less about our sheep and beef sector. So where does this leave us? This is our natural global advantage. Are we slipping out the back door and were we not even looking? I've also been pondering the value and need for long-term experimentation. We've recently had Ramos retire from ag research. He did 50-something fertiliser applications at Winchmore. There are long-term sites globally, and Rothamsted have quite recently brought their multiple long-term trials together and aligned their thinking for the next 150 years. And there's that tranche of universities across the USA the same. This is my challenge to my colleagues at Lincoln. As we face the future, where changing climate adds to pressure, and we recognise the work of Dave Chapman and others, we don't have enough data. And we don't have that luxury of the very long-term experiments. Lincoln University, you are so well placed. You've got the people, you've got some of the data sets already. And my challenge to you is, what does your next 150 years look like in terms of the richness of the data? We recently completed the Whiti Whiti program, and we put together the data supermarket. This matters to the shape of New Zealand's future. Our research is across multiple scales, from within paddocks to catchments. We research and develop the kind of data sets that we believe land managers and rural professionals need to have access to. With an eye on the horizon and beyond, there will be more indicators, and that's what we've tried to capture in our database. Because we have to balance environment with economic drivers. The data here are all open access, and they're both new research and existing research. Because what happens next to our landscape is, as we've done before, we will change. But these are consequential business decisions where science will both inform and de-risk. So as I see it, our golden era of food exporting nation is behind us. We exist in a world that does not need us. Our reality is we need them to want us and to choose us. A new world order looks much less stable and more protectionist. And that's today. I can't tell you what tomorrow will look like. Disruption to globalisation that our forebears fought so hard for is accelerating, and the protection of the WTO has passed. Free trade agreements are our future, but we have to uphold these agreements and be prepared to fight in court. But that works both ways. It means we have to be doing what we say we are doing. As a country, we need to recognise that our ambitions for environmental national bottom lines may have no simple fix, and we may need to compromise. As I look to a future with less livestock, the other options must bring new markets and the capital to have an impact. And those are challenging in a small nation with limited capital. And we need to appreciate our farmers and their worldview, and their view of transformation is not necessarily the same as ours. Are we listening? And can we deliver the science and innovation that they are going to require? Grasslands will continue to dominate our landscape, but the centre of our science must fit the future. My career, and in fact my life, has not been easy. It's been challenges and opportunities, sadness and joy. One where rising to the challenge, a really thick skin, and believing it is possible if held true. To paraphrase Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, in your life, you may not control what happens to you, but you always have the ability to choose your response. I've had to pivot and pivot. Doors have slammed, and surviving the science system and thriving has taken adaptation. I've always had an eye to the fund system. It's been my North Star. Times change, contexts change, and funding lines shift. You've got to be able to change. I once was on repeat in national TV in Australia on a top-rating children's television program talking about composting earthworms, because that's what you do when you pivot. My connections to the land and farming and the reality of life has fostered deep pragmatism. John found me during our Lincoln degree, and together we've got a pretty strong foundation. We have 3 Aussie-born kids who are healthy skeptics, deeply pragmatic adults. Don't know where they got their love of debating from. And they have a strong sense of family and community. Life is real, and it is now. Today I live with an incurable disease. Cancer will kill me in the near future. It brings its own crazy context, one where those far-back decisions can hurt like hell. It has real implications where you squeeze the most out of every moment, where you only drink the best wine and eat fillet steak. My oncologist told me that, by the way. I don't get to choose what happens to me, but I get to choose my response. And I make the best of today and choose to be an inspiration to me. Today I stand at Lincoln University, where 60% of students are female. Wow. That is amazing. And I want a future where we attract and grow budding New Zealand scientists who can thrive and build impactful careers, where our graduates across all disciplines moving into our sectors and beyond have the kind of future and the kind of fun that I have. A future where my daughter and yours, the young women of our sector and of today, get pay equity and without the crap. To you, the students in the room, be patient. It takes time to build your own foundations, to understand the complexity of the world you work in, but make sure you connect and network. I know the science is the key to overcoming challenges and realising opportunities, but it alone is not the solution. It fits best into a receptive system. We need to take heed of context. Let's not be naive, nor choose to blame others, and let's always be healthy skeptics. For New Zealand agriculture, let's learn from the journey. We've done well and we can do better. Let's use technology and collaboration to get even more done. Lincoln University, my plea is that our students are fit for the transition and transformation that is ahead. Let's think about your legacy and data sets for the next 150 years. My lessons in life have been that people make all the difference, that impact and influence are in every conversation. The economic cycles do keep happening. Keep your distance from black swans, snakes and bullets. Black swan events can and do happen. We each have the ability to always choose our response. And when life dishes you lemons, add tonic, gin, and some good friends. We have a proven track record in economic transformation, but our future transformations must be in this constrained, optimised system. It's a harder challenge where we in science and technology will need to be at the forefront. Our international markets are telling us what they expect. We have a choice. And I think we need to take our unique capabilities and adapt to meet the needs of those who care most about the type of food that we produce. And my final message is best described through the words of our most decorated Gallipoli veteran, Lieutenant Colonel Cyril Bassett, who said, "Real courage isn't just an act of daring, it's carrying on." Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Have wonderful insights in your journey through science, through agriculture, and to here today, and many key messages there. Robyn has kindly offered some time to answer questions, take your questions.
Farmer is in the audience.
Yeah, let's start.
I've got my eyes on
I'm sure you have many questions there, so please, the opportunity to do so.
I've got a question for Ron.
Yeah.
So the changes that Lincoln University Dairy Farm made when it dropped out fertiliser and lowered its stocking rate and increased its per cow production, you told me were easy. Is that true? He did this to me in a room full of farmers, by the way. The point that it was complex and challenging.
Easy to do, but hard to reverse. I think that was the significant thing at the time. We had many challenges from farmers who said, "You're nuts. It's the wrong thing to do. Don't do it." And afterwards said, "Thank you for showing the way. Thank you for showing it can be done." But there's a point that you kind of made, Robyn, in that story that I think is really important for today's audience, and that was all we did was implement research that Robyn and others had done. We didn't do the research. We simply took it and showed that it was feasible at scale. And so what we need, and part of what I said, is that research to keep going. We need P21 phase 3 and phase 4 and phase 5, because that's what will deliver what you've just said around those customer incentives that constrained optimism.
Thank you, Ron. Philip, you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Robyn. You didn't mention the changing ownership of New Zealand land. I guess the thing is that farms changing to more corporate ownership than family ownership and increasing overseas ownership of our land. Do you think that's bringing greater innovation into our landscape, or is actually greater inertia in terms of change?
I think, well, that's a really interesting question, and it's not one that I'm best qualified to answer, but I always have an opinion. Well, I have an opinion, and part of it was as we were working through our land and water work in tranche 1, we actually worked with farmers who were looking at land use transformation, and then we pulled it through for data. So I think corporate brings opportunity and constraint, and I think where it brings opportunity, see some corporate farmers down the back row, where it brings opportunity is the professional management and the capital and the ability to determine the suitability of the risk for their business. So I think that's where we will see some land use change. We've always seen land use change. So we're seeing land use change with corporates investing in forestry driven by policy. Where we see market opportunity, I think most of the significant land use change will come from family-owned corporates, New Zealand corporates, including the sovereign wealth funds and international corporates, because they're the only ones with the capital to invest in apples or whatever at scale. And I'm happy for some of you in the back row to disagree with me, but I think at scale, because the thing about horticulture, the thing about dairy cows, is if a storm comes through and you can't milk the cows for a day, they'll be back tomorrow milking. But if a storm comes through and wipes out your apples, there is no harvest. So with that risk, you've got to have the capital to manage that risk. So that's my feeling. And will corporates be good? I think when corporates stay around for long enough, their people become part of communities. And communities have to be open to their people, not just being landowners, right? So there's social as well as financial challenges to that.
John.
The point in the conversation is sort of talked about the agricultural farmers not being in that space or understanding where they need to be. And I guess sitting in the space that we are at the moment of needing change, of facilitating change, where do you think industry sits? I'm really interested in that perspective and how we enable and motivate and achieve the outcomes in a sustainable way.
Thank you, John. Now, I used to go to Young Farmers, John, 5 minutes ago, right?
Yeah. 80s.
I think it's interesting, John, so when you talk about industry, you talk about, are you thinking processes?
Well, just thinking of people and buy-in. So yes, we can go corporate has scale and opportunity and capital. The individual farmer that says, I don't believe in climate change, or I don't believe in this, or the world can go further. What shift are you seeing in I guess an acceptance of where we need to move and how we enable it?
I think the generation of young farmers coming through have been educated and started farming, stop nudging your brother, have started farming in a different time where it's not a foreign concept as it was perhaps when we came through. What I've seen, I'm going to call out Fonterra here. I think Fonterra in the last 5 years has been putting out information in a really interesting way. I feel like they've been nudging. They've been saying, hey, if a ton of silage has a greenhouse gas footprint of 1, a ton of PKE is 7 times that. And by the way, you can reduce your PKE usage this way. So I think we're seeing nudging. And now when we see these incentive payments coming out, guess what I'm getting phone calls about now? What do we do about our peat? I knew the farmer quite well, and I said, "Sell your farm and ship to Canterbury." But so I think most farmers are being exposed to the continual conversation, but it's not easy. We're asking people to change what they've always known. And yet, if we look to the future, we've got to be honest about what the world wants, don't we? So, and we've got a choice to make. We can choose. And actually, someone said to me the other day, we can sell to lesser value markets. They said, we don't have to sell to the premium markets. But guess what? Those lesser ones are not so good about paying bills. So there's some of those things, aren't there, that resonate with farmers. But so many of our farmers are so busy working in their businesses, it's hard to keep track, isn't it? So we just keep having conversations.
I've got a question for you.
Yes.
I'm the brother. What you doing, right? I got no issue with that at all. We're back here. I see entry production, and I see in mid-Canterbury where I am, huge infrastructure issues. How do we fix that? I'm not just talking about road. What I'm talking about is I'm talking about housing, I'm talking about school capacity. So go 10 years ago with Ashford College, 400 places available, and Mount College with 200 odd places available. Both still bulging at the seams now.
And thanks to the success of agriculture, right?
Yes, it is. 91%.
Maureen, you've got the answer to this, right? Because you started your
So
career.
what we've got now is infrastructure with our main road coming up here. I mean, we didn't get over 70 kilometres an hour the whole way from Rickola. We've got schools bursting with steam. We've got school buses bursting with steam.
So he's actually got the most difficult job in the country because he sets the school bus run. So every parent wants their child picked
I
up.
designed airlines.
So New Zealand's got an infrastructure challenge, right?
Yeah, and this is where I see it's all very well growing agriculture. We've got to get everything else to keep up.
You need agriculture to pay for your infrastructure, though.
Oh, we've got Insco Foods that can't bring in there.
Stop. Richard Green, you should back me up here. We are not good at investing for the long term.
What population does New Zealand be? I mean, you get right down to that time, we need 10 million people.
Yes, that's correct. That's the problem.
We don't have those discussions, do we?
No, we don't.
But we need to grow agriculture, so we then start to
Grow all industries. Don't
all industries, not just agriculture. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Yes. Can you ask me a question?
There's no easy answer. But I tell you, farmers, one thing. When farmers say to me, we want a biodiversity credit, I say I live in a house in a very small block in the centre of Christchurch, and my rates are nearly $9,000. So do not ask me on my rates to pay for your biodiversity credit. So we've got to find another way if we want to reward our farmers for what they're doing well, right? Because we do need to reward people that works best. So there's a question over here.
Sorry, there's a change of tack. Is there any one person throughout your career that has inspired you the most, a teacher, a mentor, and what was it about them that changed you?
There was a teacher in Form 2 at Longford Intermediate in Gore. So I came from a farming family. I was the first to go to university, who told me you can. And then along the way, it was as a female stepping into a male world. I mean, I think probably being brought up by the club kind of made that easy because I didn't realise I couldn't do things. But it was people like Graham Robertson, some of you will know, an exceptional leader. And they just believed in me and told me so. It's an answer. Derek note, long-term, 150-year trials.
I won't be here to see it.
Can you turn what you're doing into those, though?
Of course.
Do we need to?
Yes, we do. We have some that are 30 years on and not on your list, but depending on how the Vice Chancellor wants to put us together.
Hard to say no in a room full of people, Derek.
Yeah. I'm Robyn. I'm definitely interested in the conversation around long-term experimentation. We've seen the fundamental value of trials like Winchmore and the recent analysis of Richard McDowell, sorry, showed that from Winchmore there had been over 400 publications and had gone far beyond the original scope of a fertilizer trial on border dike irrigation and dryland site in Canterbury to deeply affect all industries: dairy, sheep, deer, arable. And what are your thoughts about what it would look like at 150-year experiment if we were to go now?
If we were to go now.
Yeah.
And Alistair Medal's got the answer for me, thank you.
How do you change the reality of the current science funding system where Winchmore is on a site which used to be owned by the government? The site was sold. One of the Winchmore trials was basically ploughed up, even although it had one of the most remarkable carbon stories probably in the world. And now the Winchmore trial is basically carried on by the generosity of the fertilizer industry, providing a relatively small amount of money. And there used to be something like 8 or so long-term trials in the pastoral sector. Now there's 1.5.
I mean, look at Ballantrae and its soil carbon data, for example. And if we had the resources to go back, Mike Dodd's about to bring out a paper from Fodder, 30 years on. So I think, Grant, to answer your question, I think we probably know how to design it because we can go back and look at the Rothamsted journey. But the challenge to that is it's easier, Derek, I think it's easier if it's like wheat in Rothamsted than it is to think about what we're doing here. But there's enough knowledge from overseas to understand how often you get to do a reset. And that's the question, Alistair, about Winchmore, isn't it? At what point do you say we need to reset and move forward? But I think, there's nearly 200 years.
The science system hasn't valued those experiments.
The science system has valued those experiments. It's not the science system.
Funding of the science system.
It's New Zealand. It's the same question about investment in infrastructure, isn't it? So the science system knows and understands the value. It's just about how we keep funding it with our model, isn't it? And it's easy in Australia because you go and dig up another mine.
Robyn, that was a magnificent presentation. Our absolute journey there that you get through, and the fabulous representation of our contribution to science. And we've got a small gift of flowers here to recognise your contribution. So thank you.
Thank you.